Hello, so I'm here with Catherine Harlow of the lecturer at the University of Reading, specialises in reception, and we're in the Classics Centre in Oxford. But we're here actually to talk about something that Catherine raised at the Democratic Turn Conference that was held at the Open University a couple of weeks ago. So Catherine, just tell us what you were, what the issues you were kind of raising at the Democratic Turn Conference.
Okay, thanks, Elton. Well, I was invited to speak at the Democratic Turn Conference by Lorna Hardwick, Professor at Open University. And actually she invited me because she thought that I would form part of what she termed an awkward squad. Questioning the idea of a democratic turn.
I like the idea of an awkward squad.
Yeah, I like the idea of being characterised as an awkward squad. I suppose the point was that I'd raised some questions about the idea of this notion of a democratic turn in classical reception studies. Everyone seemed to be using this idea of a democratic turn in a very different way. In part, we've been invited to think about it, but different people seem to have very, very different ideas of what it meant. So some people thought that a democratic turn in classics or reception studies meant studying the history of democracy, specifically the growth of modern democracy in Europe, in America and elsewhere. Other people thought it had something to do with popular culture, so classics sort of being interested in things like film, being interested in the radio, in popular novels and so on. And so rather than being these kind of elitist aesthetes in their ivory towers, it was more something to do with that. I had a bit of a different view, I suppose. I thought a democratic turn in classics would really mean what classicists do if they started thinking very, very seriously about public engagement as part of their role as classicists. So a view of lecturers in classics and the humanities as not just sitting doing our research, but also really making an effort to communicate with the wider world about interesting things to do with classics, why it's important, the role ideas of classics have played in modern culture. And of course that's really the subject matter of classical reception studies, that's the subject of our research as well.
Yeah. So, what kinds of things then did you raise at the conference related to the problem of even talking about democracy in relationship to classics?
Yeah, well, my paper was called We're All Democrats Today. And I suppose I was taken off from the view which has been expressed by quite a few political theorists that the term democratic, in the way we use it in everyday life, the way it's used in the media, the way we tend to use it in conversation, has just become so ubiquitous that it doesn't really have any meaning anymore.
Right, I see. So when you talk about something as democratic, it can be a range of things, but it tends to be in a very positive way, isn't it?
Yeah.
I guess a classic example would be, for example, the invasion of Iraq in terms of, or thinking of the invasion of Iraq in terms of democratising the Middle East, as if that could be done in the first place, but also this is an unequivocal good that you bring democracy.
Yeah, so there are two issues there, aren't there? I mean, one is the idea of democracy as something that can, in a sense, be imposed upon a people somewhere else, and the way in which people get around that argument saying, well, they really want it. Some of them may not know they want it, but they really want it, so it's not really an imposition. Yeah. But then the other sense is that democracy is the only good form of government, and the kind of thing that everyone should want. And that seems to me to be quite different from the way democracy was treated in ancient Greece, where it was just one form of government, and there were other viable forms of constitution out there as well. If you lived in a democracy, if you were an Athenian, you probably thought that it was very, very good that you did live there, because Athens was the best place. But there wasn't this sense that this incredibly positive notion of democracy took up all of the space of political imagination.
In fact, I think most of the political imagination in ancient Greece was very sceptical and critical of democracy, wasn't it? If we think of Aristotle or Plato.
Absolutely. And it's something that shocks undergraduates often when they come to really start to study classical studies, because they expect all of our texts that talk about democracy in ancient Greece to be really positive about it. And then they'll read Thucydides or Aristotle or Plato Plato, as you say, and discover, no, there are people who are very, very critical of democracy. And a lot of our texts from ancient Greece, a lot of our sources are actually critical, as you say.
And I suspect also this gets to what we mean by democracy anyway. I mean, thinking of Cicero's criticism of democracy, he's living in a republic. And actually, I think I might be saying that people have thought of modern democracy, especially, for example, the US Constitution, framed much more in terms of a republic than a true democracy, actually.
Well, that's interesting, and that's something that was picked up on by a number of contributors to the conference, I think, that in our modern sort of Western political tradition, lots of these ideas have been fused. So the notion of a democracy has been fused with the idea of a republic.
Which were very separate things in the ancient world.
Indeed. And then also we have this idea of human rights. And we think of human rights as going along with democracy. In a country like Britain, which is a liberal democracy, there's supposed to be respect for human rights and a democratic system. But in fact, the two notions are quite separate, because human rights are often thought of as protections that the individual has against the power of the government or the power of other people. So they can be an individual protection against democratic power. And that's how they've often been considered historically, as well as, I think, in some contexts today. If you think about arguments being made in various countries by Muslim women that they should be allowed to wear the veil as a matter of human rights.
Yes, that's interesting.
Against a democratic consensus or a Republican consensus that suggests that they should not be allowed to.
Yeah.
You can see how even in modern discourse these concepts come apart in a way which doesn't seem obvious if you live as we do in a liberal democracy.
Then the idea of classical reception, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about that.
Classical reception, I guess now, is generally conceived of as the study of the new meanings that ideas and objects and texts from the ancient world have come to take on in different contexts, different historical locations at different places and different times. And it's often been to do with the new meanings they've taken on, the new significances they've been given in the modern world, in the period, from the Renaissance to the present. It doesn't have to be like that, it seems to me. I mean, some of your own work, if I'm not wrong, concerns the reception of Homer in later Greek antiquity, so the new meanings that his work took on, often political meanings in later Greece. I guess one of the reasons why I think that connects with the present is because we still live in a world where these classical objects and ideas are being given new meanings. That's current in our culture. And so I suppose there's room for a bunch of people whose job it is to think very, very hard about those processes.
I see.
And to try to understand them in detail in all of their complexity. And then to really tell other people about some of those processes, some of the things that get forgot, some of the things that get simplified, or other ways we might have of forming these meanings.
Yes, I guess there's a dialogue, isn't it, between the classical world and the modern world, whatever that modern world might be. So it's both in terms of thinking about the classical texts themselves and how they somehow speak to different generations, but then looking at those different generations and how they receive these classical texts.
Yes, exactly.
And then how they receive them says something rather interesting about that particular cultural framework.
Yeah, and often, the stories are much weirder than you'd imagine, so quite a lot of work has been done on the entry of the term democracy into modern political thought. We have two traditions of thinking about democracy really in the modern world. One which follows our ancient sources much more closely in thinking of democracy as something to be worried about, as a worrying possibility. And then we have a new view, which is the one we inhabit now, which seems to suggest that democracy is not only the best form of government, but the only good form of government at all. And it's surprisingly short in its history, that different